My name is Ally. For 30 years, I lived as a ghost in my own family, a reliable shadow waiting for a light that I finally realized would never come. I spent a lifetime trying to be enough, trying to polish the rough edges of my life to fit into a refined world that was never built for me or my children. I never imagined that the people who gave me life would one day look me in the eye and tell me my children weren't good enough for their holiday table. I never thought that a mother's love could come with a price tag, or that a brother's silence could be so loud. Before I share the raw, unfiltered truth of how I finally broke those chains, I want to say a heartfelt thank you. Your presence here, in this digital sanctuary, means more to me than words can ever express. Thank you for giving me your time and for lending me your heart. If this story touches you, if it resonates with a struggle you've endured, or if it gives you the strength to stand tall, I humbly invite you to subscribe and join our family here at Queen's Revenge. And to those of you who have already subscribed and stood by me, I wish you a life overflowing with abundance. May your wealth multiply, may your paths be clear, and may your heart stay perpetually full of the kind of happiness that no one, not even those closest to you, can ever take away. This is my story of reclamation. This is how I stopped being a shadow and started being a queen. The kitchen was bathed in the amber glow of a late November afternoon, a sanctuary of domestic warmth that I had spent years meticulously cultivating. The air was thick and sweet, a heavy tapestry woven from the scents of roasted pumpkin, simmering cloves, and the sharp, comforting bite of cinnamon. It was a humdrum Tuesday, the kind of day that usually felt like a soft blanket, anchored by the rhythmic thumping of flour-dusted rolling pins and the distant, melodic symphony of my children's laughter. From the living room, the sound of Emma and Lucas echoed, a bright, percussive giggling as they engineered an elaborate fortress out of sofa cushions and discarded blankets. Emma, 7 years old and possessing a heart far too large for her fragile frame, was patiently explaining the rules of the castle to 4-year-old Lucas, whose only contribution was a series of exuberant, high-pitched shrieks of joy. In that moment, watching the golden dust motes dance in the light, I felt an overwhelming sense of arrival. I had built this. I had created a world where love was loud, messy, and unconditional. When the phone vibrated against the granite countertop, the jarring hum felt like a hairline fracture appearing on a piece of fine porcelain. I wiped my hands on my apron, a smudge of flour ghosting across the screen as I saw the word, Mom, flashing with a persistence that always made my pulse quicken. Despite the decades of subtle dismissals and the quiet, aching disparity in how she treated my brother Daniel versus myself, I still harbored a desperate, childlike hope for a bridge to be built. I answered with a smile in my voice, already picturing the sprawling mahogany table at my parents' house, the vintage lace tablecloth, and the familiar, heavy silver that signaled the arrival of Thanksgiving. I imagined my children's faces illuminated by candlelight, their small hands reaching for rolls, their presence finally cementing our place within the family lineage. Honey, we need to talk about Thanksgiving this year, my mother began. Her voice was uncharacteristically light, a brittle, performative cheerfulness that immediately sent a visceral chill cascading down my spine. It was the tone she used when she was about to deliver a blow while pretending she was handing me a gift. I leaned against the counter, my fingers tracing the cold edge of a ceramic mixing bowl. Of course, Mom. I was just thinking about what sides I should bring. The kids are already asking if we can make those maple-glazed carrots they loved last year. There was a pause, a silence so heavy and vacuum-like that it seemed to suck the very warmth out of the room. I heard her clear her throat, a sharp, clinical sound. Well, that's actually what I wanted to discuss. Your father and I have been thinking, and we've decided to do things a little differently this time. We're aiming for something more intimate. A smaller dinner, really. Just the adults. We feel like we need a bit of a reprieve, you know? Something sophisticated and quiet. A frown tugged at my lips, a sense of confused incredulity blooming in my chest. Just adults? So, no grandchildren at all this year? Mom, the kids have been counting down the days. They adore you. They've been practicing their pilgrim stories for weeks. Another pause followed, longer this time, fraught with a tension that felt like a tightening noose. Well, she began, her voice gaining a defensive edge, not exactly. Daniel and Sophie are still bringing their boys. But you know how it is, ally. Their boys are, well, they're older, and they're so quiet. They've been raised with such a sense of decorum. They're very refined, really. It's quite easy to have them at a formal table. But Emma and Lucas, they're just so energetic. They're a bit much for the atmosphere we're trying to create this year. We thought it would be better, more relaxing for everyone, if you just found a sitter for them. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The laughter from the living room suddenly sounded distant, as if it were coming from the bottom of a deep, dark well. The word, refined, hung in the air like a poisonous vapor, a coded insult that stripped my children of their worth and painted them as savages at the gates of a sophisticated kingdom. The rejection was not a suggestion, it was a verdict. It was a cold, calculated statement that my children were a burden to be managed, while Daniel's children were a legacy to be celebrated. You're telling me, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that shook with a sudden, jagged heat, that my children aren't welcome in your home? That my 7-year-old and my 4-year-old are too energetic to sit at a table where their cousins are invited? You're excluding them because they're, what? Not quiet enough for your aesthetic? Oh, ally, don't be so dramatic, she sighed, her tone shifting into that familiar, condescending clip that had silenced me 1,000 times in my youth. It isn't personal. It's just about the environment. We want a peaceful evening. Surely you can understand that? You and Liam are still invited, of course. We'd love to have you. We just think the children would be happier elsewhere. The superficiality of her love was suddenly laid bare, a thin, peeling veneer over a core of profound indifference. For years, I had made excuses for them. I had ignored the way they missed Emma's dance recitals but never missed Daniel's son's soccer matches. I had swallowed the bitterness when their Christmas gifts were always a little less thoughtful, a little less grand than the ones given to the golden children. I had convinced myself that love was a spectrum, and perhaps I was just on the quieter end of it. But this was different. This was an amputation. It is personal, Mom, I said, my grip on the phone so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white. It's the most personal thing you've ever done. You are looking at 2 innocent children who worship you and telling them they aren't good enough to eat dinner in your presence. You are choosing a peaceful evening over your own flesh and blood. If you're going to be difficult, then I suppose there's no talking to you, she snapped, her irritation flaring like a struck match. We've made our decision. You can either come and enjoy a lovely adult dinner with your family, or you can stay home and harbor your resentment. The choice is yours. Suit yourself. The line went dead with a sharp, final click. I stood frozen in the center of my beautiful, cinnamon-scented kitchen, the silence rushing in to fill the space where my mother's voice had been. I looked down at my hands, they were trembling. A visceral wave of nausea rolled through me, followed by a searing, incandescent rage. It was the kind of anger that didn't scream, it burned steady and white-hot, cauterizing the wounds of a lifetime of not being enough. From the living room, Lucas shouted, Mommy. Look. The fort is a giant dragon. I turned slowly to look at them. They were beautiful. They were vibrant, loud, messy, and filled with a pure, unadulterated light that my parents were no longer worthy of standing in. I realized then that I had been trying to force my children into a puzzle that was never designed to hold them. I had been begging for a seat at a table that was built on the exclusion of my own heart. The porcelain hadn't just fractured, it had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and I had no intention of gluing it back together. I took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of cinnamon now cloying and bitter. I wasn't just a daughter anymore, I was a mother. And a mother's first duty is to protect her children from the people who would make them feel small, even if those people are the ones who gave her life. They had made their choice, a choice rooted in a hollow, superficial refinement. Now, it was time for me to make mine. And I knew, with a terrifying, liberating clarity, that they would never see us at that table again. I walked toward the living room, forcing the tremor out of my limbs and the tears back into my eyes. Hey, you two, I called out, my voice sounding like a stranger's to my own ears. How about we forget about Grandma's house this year? How about we make our own Thanksgiving? Just us. With the biggest fort anyone has ever seen. They cheered, oblivious to the war that had just been declared. I knelt on the floor, pulling them both into my arms, holding them with a fierce, desperate strength. The fracture was complete. The break was clean. And for the first time in my life, I felt the cold, hard weight of my own power. The silence that followed the disconnection of the call was not empty, it was a heavy, suffocating shroud that seemed to press against my skin with the weight of 30 years of unuttered grievances. I stood motionless in the kitchen, my hands still hovering over the cold granite, watching the steam rise from a forgotten cup of tea. It occurred to me then, with a clarity so sharp it felt like a physical incision, that my life had never been my own. I had been an auxiliary character in a narrative written by my parents, a script where my brother Daniel was the undisputed protagonist, the shining sun around which our entire family system orbited, and I was merely the shadow, expected to be present, expected to be useful, but never expected to be seen. This favoritism was not a series of isolated incidents or emotional lapses, it was a calculated family architecture. My parents had spent decades drafting the blueprints of a dynasty where one child was the heir to all their pride and the other was the steward of all their burdens. Daniel was the paragon of everything they valued, or rather, everything they wished to project to the world. He was the refined son, the one whose mediocrity was polished until it gleamed like gold, while my own achievements were treated as standard maintenance, as expected as the rising sun and just as easily ignored. I remembered my college graduation, a day I had worked toward with a desperate, bone-deep exhaustion, graduating magna cum laude while working 2 jobs. My parents had attended, yes, but their conversation at dinner had been entirely consumed by Daniel's recent promotion, a job my father had helped him secure through a golf course connection. I sat there, the weight of my honors tassel feeling like a leaden yoke, as they toasted to his natural leadership, while barely glancing at my diploma. The disparity was not just in what they gave, but in what they noticed. As I stared out the kitchen window at the skeletal branches of the oaks shivering in the November wind, the memories began to cascade, each one a stone in the altar of my resentment. I thought of the countless weekends I had spent driving 2 hours to their home because my father couldn't figure out the settings on his new television, or because my mother had accidentally deleted her email account for the 10th time. I was the reliable one. I was the one who curated their grocery lists, who organized their anniversary parties, who listened to their endless complaints about the neighbors. I was the invisible engine that kept their lives running smoothly, fueled by a starvation-level hope that if I were just helpful enough, just indispensable enough, they would finally look at me with the same soft, adoring eyes they reserved for Daniel. Daniel, meanwhile, was a ghost. He showed up for the holidays to collect his accolades and his expensive gifts, rarely lifting a finger to help clear a plate or pour a drink. He was the busy one, the successful one, whose time was far too valuable to be wasted on the mundane mechanics of family life. My parents treated his presence like a divine visitation, a grace they were lucky to receive, while my presence was a service they felt entitled to consume. This juxtaposition was the foundation of our family. The more I did, the less I was worth, the less Daniel did, the more he was worshipped. It extended, with a cruel and systematic precision, to our children. I looked toward the living room where Emma and Lucas were still playing, their innocence a fragile shield against the architectural neglect of their grandparents. My parents had never missed one of Daniel's son's soccer matches, driving 3 towns over in the pouring rain to cheer from the sidelines. Yet, when Emma had her first solo dance recital, a moment she had practiced for until her little toes were bruised, my mother had called an hour before to say she felt a bit of a headache coming on and couldn't make it. I had watched Emma scan the audience from the stage, her bright eyes dimming when she saw the empty seat beside me. I had lied to her then. I had told her grandma was sick. But the truth was simpler, Emma wasn't a golden child. She didn't possess the refinement of Daniel's boys, which was really just my mother's code for a child who didn't demand the inconvenience of genuine emotional engagement. A sudden, sharp vibration from my phone broke the trance. A text message from my father. Ally, I'm having trouble with the new tablet your brother got me for my birthday. The screen keeps freezing. Can you swing by this weekend and fix it? Also, your mother wants to know if you can pick up her heart medication on your way. The pharmacy by your house has the better price. In any other week, in any other year, would have replied instantly. I would have checked my calendar, rearranged our family hike, and made the drive, convincing myself that this was what families do. But today, the words felt like an insult to my intelligence. They wanted the technician. They wanted the delivery driver. They wanted the reliable shadow to perform her duties so they could have their refined Thanksgiving with the son they actually loved. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve solidify in my chest. The services were officially closed. I put the phone back on the counter without replying. It was a small act, almost microscopic in the grand scheme of our history, but it felt like the first brick being removed from the base of their pedestal. If I was not worthy of being treated as a daughter, if my children were not worthy of being treated as grandchildren, then they were no longer entitled to the labor of my love. I watched the typing bubbles appear on the screen a few minutes later, my father wondering why the immediate confirmation hadn't arrived. I ignored it. I walked away from the phone, toward the living room, and sat on the floor with Emma and Lucas. I let them crawl over me, their laughter filling the spaces where my parents' approval used to live. The internal shift was violent and quiet all at once. I was withdrawing from the bank of their expectations, realizing that the debt they claimed I owed them for my upbringing had been paid 1,000 times over in the currency of my own self-respect. The architecture was crumbling. I was no longer a support beam for a house that didn't want me. I was the architect of my own home now, and in this house, there would be no golden pedestals, no reliable shadows, only the messy, loud, and absolute equality of being loved for exactly who we were. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple dusk, I felt the first true breath of freedom I had ever known. It was the breath of a woman who had finally decided to stop being useful and start being whole. The living room had been transformed into a sprawling, labyrinthine citadel of velvet cushions and mismatched woolen blankets, a physical manifestation of my children's boundless, untainted imagination. Emma was the self-appointed architect, her small, nimble fingers securing the corners of a heavy duvet with oversized plastic clips, while Lucas acted as the exuberant laborer, dragging stuffed animals into the cavernous depths of their fabric sanctuary. To them, this was a fortress of impenetrable joy, a space where the laws of the adult world, logic, schedules, and the quiet cruelty of social hierarchies, held no dominion. Watching them from the doorway, my chest felt tight, constricted by a grief so sharp it threatened to puncture the very air in my lungs. They were so beautifully, tragically oblivious. They had no inkling that the people they regarded as the twin pillars of their universe, the grandparents who smelled of peppermint and old books, had just moments ago discarded them like inconvenient footnotes in a more refined story. The sanctity of their childhood felt like a gossamer veil, so thin and fragile that even a whispered truth might tear it asunder. I leaned against the doorframe, my shadow stretching across the hardwood floor toward their fort, a dark reminder of the reality I was forced to carry alone. Emma emerged from a tunnel of pillows, her hair a chaotic halo of static-charged strands, her eyes bright with the kind of unadulterated excitement that only a 7-year-old can possess. She held up a small, hand-drawn map, the edges jagged and the colors bleeding into one another. "Look, Mommy. This is the map to Grandma's house from our castle. We're going to build a secret tunnel so we can get there faster for Thanksgiving. Lucas says we should bring the dragon to protect the turkey." Her words were a physical blow, a rhythmic thud against the raw nerves of my heart. The vulnerability in her voice, the easy, unthinking assumption that she was wanted, that her presence was a fundamental requirement for the holiday, made me want to drop to my knees and howl at the unfairness of it all. How do you tell a child that the hero of her stories has closed the gates? How do you explain to a 4-year-old that his energetic laughter is considered a pollutant in the air of his grandfather's home? I forced my features into a practiced facade, a mask of maternal calm that felt like it was made of cracking plaster. I had to be the guardian of their light, even as my own world was being eclipsed by a cold, calculating shadow. "That's a wonderful map, sweetie," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin and distant, as if I were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. I walked into the room, stepping over a stray wooden block, and sat on the edge of the sofa, the familiar fabric providing a grounding sensation against my trembling limbs. Lucas scrambled out from under a blue fleece blanket, his face flushed and a smear of chocolate still ghosting near his lip. He climbed into my lap, his small body a warm, solid weight that reminded me of everything I had to lose, and everything I was determined to protect. He smelled of laundry detergent and maple syrup, the scent of a life that was still sweet, still pure, still untouched by the bitterness of being too much. "Will Grandpa let me wear his big hat this year?" Lucas asked, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "The one with the feathers?" The memory of last year's Thanksgiving flickered through my mind like a ghost, my father laughing as he placed his old hunting cap on Lucas's head, the boy's eyes wide with wonder. It had seemed so real then, that affection. But now, I saw it for what it was, a performative kindness, a seasonal indulgence that could be revoked the moment it became an inconvenience. The disparity between the grandfather Lucas imagined and the man who had just agreed to exclude him for the sake of a peaceful evening was a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. I realized then that my parents didn't love my children as people, they loved them as accessories to their own narrative of a successful family. And when the accessories became too loud or too difficult to manage, they were simply returned to the shelf. I smoothed Lucas's hair, my fingers lingering on the soft curls. I felt a fierce, predatory protectiveness rising within me, a maternal instinct that had transitioned from a gentle hum to a deafening roar. My children were not inconveniences. They were the very heartbeat of my existence. If my parents couldn't see the radiant, chaotic brilliance of Emma and Lucas, then they didn't deserve to witness a single second of it. They didn't deserve the hand-drawn maps, the pilgrim stories, or the exuberant shrieks of joy. They had chosen a hollow, silent refinement, and I was going to ensure they received exactly what they asked for. But the preparation for the coming storm was a lonely endeavor. I could see the holidays approaching on the calendar like an inevitable tidal wave, a succession of days that would require me to dismantle the traditions my children loved without destroying their sense of security. I would have to navigate the questions about why we weren't going to the big house, why the golden cousins were there and we were not, and why the phone had stopped ringing with Grandpa's voice. I was building my own fortress now, not out of pillows and blankets, but out of silence, boundaries, and a resolute refusal to let my children feel the sting of being discarded. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room, I watched Emma return to her fortress, whispering instructions to her dragon to keep the castle safe. I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't the uninvitation itself, it was the theft of their belonging. My parents had looked at these two souls, these small, developing humans who looked for their reflection in their grandparents' eyes, and decided that the reflection wasn't worth the effort. They had fractured the porcelain of our family, but they had also unleashed a version of me they weren't prepared to face. I pulled Lucas closer, resting my chin on the top of his head. The facade held for now, but beneath it, I was hardening. I was the reliable shadow no more. I was the fire that would keep my children warm in the winter they didn't know was coming. The holidays would be different this year, they would be smaller, quieter in some ways, and perhaps more difficult, but they would be honest. There would be no more begging for scraps of affection from a table that had no room for us. As the room grew dark, the only light coming from the glowing stars Emma had pasted onto the ceiling of her fort, I made a silent vow to my sleeping son, I will be your hero, even if I have to burn the old world down to keep you safe. The morning arrived with a pale, anemic light that filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the floor that looked like the ribcage of a dying beast. I had barely slept, my mind a turbulent whirlpool of replays and imagined retorts. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice, that clipped, airy dismissiveness that had the power to make me feel like a hysterical stranger in my own skin. I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching Emma and Lucas eat their oatmeal. They were quiet this morning, perhaps sensing the tectonic shift in the atmosphere, or perhaps simply exhausted from the emotional labor of building their citadel the night before. I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw only wonder, only growth, only the messy, beautiful process of becoming. To the world, they were miracles, to my parents, they were a logistical error. The vibration of my phone on the wooden surface was like a gunshot in the silence. I didn't even have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The family machinery was in motion. The golden child had been deployed to restore the status quo. Ally, Daniel began, his voice saturated with a weary, practiced exasperation. He didn't offer a greeting or ask how the kids were. He stepped immediately into the role of the arbiter, the rational man burdened by his sister's unnecessary drama. Mom called me this morning. She's a wreck. Why do you always have to make everything so incredibly difficult? The word difficult hit me like a physical blow, an abrasive rasp against a fresh wound. It was the label they had pinned to my chest since I was old enough to speak my own mind. If I wasn't being useful, I was being difficult. If I wasn't being silent, I was being dramatic. Difficult, Daniel? I asked, my voice dangerously level. Is that what we're calling it now? I was told my children weren't welcome at the Thanksgiving table because they lack refinement. I was told my 7-year-old and 4-year-old are too energetic for a dinner that your children are invited to. And you think I am the one being difficult? I heard him sigh on the other end, a long, theatrical exhale that suggested he was speaking to a recalcitrant toddler. Look, I get that it feels personal, but you have to look at it from their perspective. They're getting older. They want a peaceful, sophisticated evening. And let's be honest, Ally, your kids can be a lot. They're wild. They don't have the same boundaries that my boys do. Mom and Dad just want one night where they don't have to worry about juice spills or someone screaming because they didn't get the right colored plate. The air left my lungs. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was a solidified fact, articulated in the familiar, smug baritone of my own brother. A lot. The phrase was a dagger, sharpened by the same whetstone our mother used. It was the ultimate gaslighting tactic, taking the natural, vibrant developmental stages of childhood and pathologizing them to justify exclusion. My children weren't wild, they were children. They were 4 and 7. They were full of life and curiosity. But in the sterile, architectural perfection of the family Daniel had helped build, life was an intrusion. A lot? I repeated, the heat in my chest flaring into a white-hot spark of rage. They are your niece and nephew, Daniel. They are the children who think you're a hero. And you're sitting there, agreeing with the idea that they should be sequestered like some kind of social embarrassment so you can have a sophisticated dinner? Do you even hear yourself? I'm being realistic, he snapped, his tone shifting from condescending to abrasive. You've always had this chip on your shoulder about how I'm treated, and now you're using your kids as a shield to pick a fight. It's just one dinner, Ally. Get a sitter, come to the house, apologize to Mom for the scene you made, and let's move on. Don't ruin the holiday for everyone else just because you want to be a martyr. The realization hit me then, cold and absolute, Daniel wasn't just a bystander in this. He was complicit. He was the beneficiary of my marginalization. For him to maintain his position as the shining sun, I had to remain the reliable shadow, and my children had to be the inconveniences. If he stood up for me, he risked the discomfort of my parents' disapproval. If he stayed silent, or worse, joined in the condemnation, he secured his own seat at the head of the table. He was protecting his own comfort at the expense of my children's belonging. I am not ruining the holiday, Daniel, I said, my voice shaking with the force of my conviction. Mom and Dad ruined it the moment they put a price tag on my children's presents. And you're ruining it now by showing me exactly who you are. You don't care about Emma and Lucas. You care about the piece of a house that is built on the backs of people you've decided aren't worth the effort. You're being hysterical, he muttered. This is exactly why they didn't want the kids there. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I guess. You're all just exhausting. Then stop trying to reach me, I replied. If we're so exhausting, let us go. Enjoy your refined dinner. Enjoy the silence of a house where no one laughs too loud or spills their juice. But don't you dare call me again to tell me how I should feel about my children being discarded. I hung up before he could respond, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked down at the table. Emma was watching me, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. She didn't know the specifics of the call, but she knew the language of my face. She knew the look of a woman who had just been exiled from her own tribe. "Was that Uncle Daniel?" she asked softly. "Yes, baby," I said, reaching over to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. My hand was still trembling, but my voice was firm. "He was just calling to check in. But listen to me, we aren't going to Grandma's for Thanksgiving. We're staying here. We're going to have the biggest, messiest, loudest dinner in history. We're going to make a mess, and we're going to laugh until our stomachs hurt, and no one is going to tell us we're too much." Emma's face broke into a tentative smile. "Really? No fancy clothes?" "No fancy clothes," I promised. "Just us. Because us is exactly enough." As she went back to her oatmeal, I felt the final tether snap. The family unit I had spent 30 years trying to appease was no longer a refuge, it was a cage. They were all complicit, the mother who excluded, the father who remained silent, and the brother who facilitated the gaslighting. I was marginalized in the very place I was supposed to be most secure. But as I watched my children, I realized that the margin was where the real life was. It was where the love was. I took a sip of my cold coffee and felt a strange, terrifying peace settle over me. The betrayal was deep, and the sting was visceral, but the clarity was a gift. I finally knew the price of admission to their world, and I was no longer willing to pay it. The golden child could have the pedestal, I would take the fort. The afternoon light began to recede, leaving the kitchen in a state of bruised violet shadows that mirrored the cold clarity settling in my chest. I sat at the island, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood, performing a silent, agonizing audit of the last decade. It was an epiphany that arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the steady, rhythmic drip of a leaking faucet, a realization of how much of my identity had been cannibalized to fuel my parents' comfort. I looked at my hands and saw the ghosts of 1,000 errands, the phantom weight of grocery bags I'd carried into their house while Daniel sat on their sofa, and the invisible ink of 100 logistical fires I had extinguished without so much as a thank you. I hadn't been a daughter, I had been an unpaid concierge, a domestic steward tasked with maintaining the machinery of their lives while they reserved their affection for the son who barely bothered to grease the gears. The word concierge tasted like ash in my mouth. It was the only fitting title for the role I had played with such desperate, pathetic subservience. When my father's Wi-Fi faltered, it wasn't Daniel he called, it was me. I was the one who crawled behind the dusty mahogany cabinet to reset the router while my father complained about the unreliability of modern things. When my mother needed her garden beds mulched or her sprawling holiday cards addressed and stamped, she didn't dream of inconveniencing Daniel. His time was far too valuable, his career far too taxing. Instead, she called me, often couch-bound with a toddler or mid-deadline at my own job, and I, driven by a starving need for approval, always said yes. I had convinced myself that this labor was the currency of family, a sacrificial offering that would eventually buy me a seat at the table of their hearts. But as I sat in the gathering gloom, I realized that our relationship was entirely transactional, yet I was the only one honoring the debt. I was the bank, and they were the perpetual borrowers, taking my time, my energy, and my peace, only to reinvest the dividends into Daniel. Daniel, the shining sun, was allowed to be a guest in his own family. He arrived for the refined dinners, accepted the expensive birthday checks, and left before the first dish touched the sink. His lack of contribution was framed as a mark of his success, while my constant availability was treated as a baseline expectation, as unremarkable as the air they breathed and just as easily ignored. The disparity was architectural, built into the very foundation of how we functioned. I remembered a Tuesday last month when my mother called me in tears because she couldn't find her favorite emerald brooch. I had dropped everything, loaded the kids into the car, and spent 3 hours scouring her house until I found it tucked inside a velvet-lined jewelry box she'd forgotten about. Her thank you had been a distracted peck on the cheek before she spent the next hour showing me photos of Daniel's new office view. I had been the laborer, the seeker of lost things, the emotional shock absorber for her minor anxieties, yet I remained a ghost in the room the moment the conversation turned to her successful son. This was the parasitism I had allowed to flourish. I had fed them my autonomy, and in return, they had grown fat on my labor while starving my children of their presence. The realization made me feel physically ill, a visceral, nauseating rejection of my own history. I had taught them how to treat me. I had signaled, through every errand run and every fire doused, that my boundaries were porous and my worth was tied to my utility. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from my father, oblivious to the war that had been declared in the silence of my kitchen. Ally, I'm at the pharmacy. They say your mother's blood pressure script isn't ready because of some insurance hitch. Can you call the provider and sort it out? I don't have the patience for the hold music. Also, don't forget we need the patio furniture moved into the shed before the frost hits tonight. Let me know when you can head over. In the past, I would have been on the phone with the insurance company within minutes, my heart racing with the stress of solving a problem that wasn't mine. I would have already been calculating how to bundle the kids into their coats to go move heavy wrought iron chairs in the freezing dark. But today, I simply stared at the blue bubbles on the screen. The demand for my time felt like a physical intrusion, a hand reaching into my home to snatch away the peace I was trying to build for Emma and Lucas. The withdrawal began then. Not with a shout, but with a profound, resonant silence. I didn't reply. I didn't call the insurance company. I didn't offer an excuse or a maybe later. I watched the screen dim and go black, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt a surge of intoxicating, terrifying power. I was cutting the wires. I was unplugging the invisible engine that had kept their lives running at the expense of my own. If I was too energetic for their Thanksgiving, if my children were too unrefined for their table, then I was certainly too busy to be their insurance agent or their groundskeeper. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The phone buzzed again, a follow-up. Ally? Did you get my text? I'm still at the pharmacy. I walked to the drawer, pulled out my charging cable, and plugged the phone in, leaving it face down on the counter. I wouldn't be the one to solve the insurance hitch. I wouldn't be the one to save my father from the tedium of hold music. Let Daniel do it. Let the refined son handle the mundane, abrasive realities of aging parents. Or, better yet, let them handle it themselves. I was reclaiming the hours I had wasted in their service, reinvesting that stolen time into the two little people in the next room who actually loved me without conditions. The internal sensation of this withdrawal was like shedding a skin that had grown too tight. It was a peeling away of the subservience I had worn like a uniform. I realized that by being their reliable shadow, I had been complicit in my own marginalization. I had allowed them to believe that my love was a service they could order off a menu, provided I was the one doing the cooking. I walked into the living room, where the fort was still standing, a beacon of messy, unrefined joy. Emma looked up, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a cartoon. Are you okay, Mommy? You look different. I sat down on the floor, leaning my back against the castle walls she had so carefully constructed. I felt lighter than I had in years, the weight of 1,000 unearned obligations lifting from my shoulders. I'm great, sweetie, I said, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a lie. I just realized I don't have to go anywhere I'm not wanted. And I don't have to do things for people who don't see how lucky they are to know you. I stayed there, immersed in the world of my children, while in the other room, my phone continued to pulse with the increasingly frantic demands of a family that was about to find out exactly how much a reliable shadow was worth once the light was finally turned off. The transactional era of my life was over. The bank was closed. And the silence was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived not with the usual frantic cadence of an impending performance, but with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from my chest. In years past, this day was a marathon of anxiety. I would wake at dawn, my nerves already frayed, obsessing over the exact consistency of the sweet potato casserole I was expected to bring, or triple-checking the outfits of my children to ensure they met my mother's unspoken standards of decorum. I had spent a lifetime walking on eggshells, terrified that a single spill, a loud laugh, or a unrefined comment from my children would shatter the fragile peace of my parents' mahogany and silver kingdom. But today, as the sun began to spill a pale, honeyed light across our kitchen floor. The atmosphere was one of absolute, unadulterated serenity. There were no starch-stiffened collars today. There were no hushed warnings to stay clean or speak only when spoken to. Instead, the house was alive with a messy, rhythmic joy. Liam, whose presence had always been a steady anchor in my turbulent family seas, stood at the stove, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He was flipping pancakes with an exaggerated flair that sent Emma and Lucas into fits of breathless giggling. We were all in our pajamas, faded flannels and mismatched socks, surrounded by the beautiful, chaotic debris of a family simply being. The air didn't smell of the stiff, formal perfumes of my mother's parlor. It smelled of maple syrup, toasted flour, and the raw, earthy scent of real life. "Look, Mommy. I made a flower ghost," Lucas shouted, holding up a palm coated in white powder. He patted his cheeks, leaving ghostly handprints that matched the dusting already covering his nose. In my parents' house, this would have been a catastrophe, a breach of the refined aesthetic they curated so desperately. Here, it was a masterpiece. I felt a surge of something fierce and warm in my gut, a sense of being entirely unburdened. I realized then that I had spent years trying to polish the rough edges of my life to fit into their gallery, only to realize that the rough edges were where the love lived. Our celebration was small, intimate, and profoundly authentic. We weren't performing for an audience of judgmental eyes, we were witnessing each other. As the morning drifted into afternoon, the serenity deepened. We didn't rush to the car. We didn't check the clock with the frantic pulse of the perpetually late. We built a second fortress in the living room, drank hot cocoa with too many marshmallows, and prepared a turkey that was perhaps a little too brown on the edges but tasted like freedom. Liam caught my eye as he helped Emma stir the cranberry sauce, his expression soft and knowing. He didn't have to ask if I regretted my choice. He could see the answer in the way I was breathing, deep, full breaths that didn't catch in my throat. I was no longer a daughter waiting for a verdict, I was a mother presiding over a sanctuary. Then, the intrusion came. The phone, sitting on the far end of the counter, began to vibrate with a jarring, percussive intensity. The ringtone, once a sound that signaled a call to duty, now sounded like a cacophony of entitlement breaking through the peace. I didn't reach for it. I watched it dance across the granite, Mom, flashing on the screen like a warning light. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. And then again. The persistence was frantic, a digital screaming that demanded my immediate subservience. On the fourth call, I felt a shadow of the old anxiety flicker in my chest, but I suppressed it. I swiped to answer, stepping away from the laughter of the kitchen into the quiet of the hallway. "Hello, Mom," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the usual apologetic tremor. The voice that exploded through the receiver was not the refined, melodic tone she saved for her guests. It was a shrill, jagged cacophony of fury. "Ally. Where on earth have you been? Do you have any idea what kind of morning we've had here? Your father is in a state, and the dinner is practically ruined." "I'm at home, Mom," I said calmly. "I told you I wouldn't be coming. I thought you were just being difficult. I didn't think you'd actually be so selfish as to abandon your family on Thanksgiving. And to top it off, your father tried to use the card this morning, the one we've used for years for the holiday groceries, and it was declined. At the store, Ally. In front of everyone. He had to call Daniel to come down and pay for the turkey like a common beggar." I leaned against the wall, a cold, hard smile touching my lips. The card she was referring to was the authorized user account I had added them to years ago during my father's surgery, the one I had forgotten to remove them from, and the one they had treated as their personal slush fund ever since. The realization that they were more upset about the loss of my money than the loss of my presence was the final, stinging confirmation I needed. "It's my card, Mom," I said, my voice gaining a dangerous edge of steel. "I canceled it. I decided that since I'm too unrefined to sit at your table, my money is probably too energetic for your wallet. If Daniel is the golden son, let him pay for the golden turkey." "How dare you," she shrieked, the sound so sharp I had to pull the phone away from my ear. after everything we've done for you. We raised you, we supported you, and this is how you repay us? By humiliating your father in public over a few $100s? You are being incredibly petty and dramatic. You're ruining the holiday for everyone. No, Mom, I interrupted, my heart hammering with a strange, exhilarating rhythm. I'm not ruining the holiday. I'm having the best Thanksgiving of my life. I'm sitting in a house where my children are loved, not tolerated. I'm eating a meal that isn't seasoned with your disapproval. The only person ruining your day is you, because you've realized that the reliable shadow has finally walked into the light. You'll regret this, ally, she hissed, her voice dropping into a low, venomous thrum. You can't just cut us off like this. Family is family. Family is a choice, Mom, I replied. And you've spent 30 years choosing Daniel and his refined life over me. You've spent 7 years choosing his children over mine. Today, I'm just returning the favor. Enjoy your dinner. I hope the silence is exactly what you wanted. I ended the call before she could unleash another torrent of vitriol. I stood in the hallway for a moment, the silence of the house rushing back in to heal the wound her voice had made. The cacophony was gone. The intrusion had failed. I felt lighter than air, as if the gravity of her expectations had finally lost its hold on me. I walked back into the kitchen. The room was warm, the light was golden, and my children were covered in flour, laughing as Liam pretended to be a turkey monster. It was messy. It was loud. It was entirely unrefined. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I sat back down at the table, took a deep breath of the cinnamon-scented air, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, deeply thankful. The services were closed, the card was dead, and the woman who had spent her life trying to be enough had finally realized that she was already everything. The echo of my mother's final, vitriolic shriek lingered in the hallway long after the screen of my phone had gone dark. I stood paralyzed for a moment, the festive sounds of my own household, the rhythmic clink of silverware, Liam's low-thrumming hum, the soft pitter-patter of children's feet, feeling suddenly distant, as if I were underwater. A cold, surgical curiosity began to override my anger. I walked back to the kitchen island, ignored the cooling remains of my dinner, and opened my laptop. My hands were steady now, fueled by a grim, investigative resolve. I logged into my primary credit card portal, the one I used for household expenses and travel, and began to scroll. I had added my parents as authorized users 5 years ago, during the bleak, terrifying months following my father's heart surgery. At the time, their finances had been decimated by a labyrinth of medical bills and lost wages. I had handed them those cards as a lifeline, a temporary bridge to keep them afloat until the storm passed. Just for essentials, I had told them, my heart overflowing with a daughter's desperate desire to provide a safety net for the people who had brought her into the world. But life had become a whirlwind, promotions, the birth of Lucas, the frantic pace of building a career, and the bridge had never been dismantled. I had simply stopped looking at the itemized statements, trusting the people I loved to honor the sanctity of that gift. As I began to audit the last 24 months, the sheer scale of their parasitic behavior made the room spin. It wasn't just the occasional grocery run or a tank of gas. There, nestled between my own mortgage payments and utility bills, was a consistent, rhythmic siphoning of my life's work. Monthly subscriptions to high-end cable packages I didn't own. Frequent charges at boutiques in the upscale mall near their home. Extravagant dinners at steakhouses on Friday nights, nights when I had stayed late at the office to ensure my own children's future. They hadn't just used the card, they had colonized it. They had treated my bank account as a bottomless well, a silent endowment for a lifestyle they could no longer afford on their own, all while treating me as a social and emotional afterthought. The audacity of it was breathtaking. I looked at a charge from 2 weeks ago, a $300 purchase at a luxury toy store. I closed my eyes, remembering the extra gifts Daniel's boys had received for their birthdays, items my mother had claimed she found on sale. She hadn't found them, I had bought them. I had unknowingly funded the very disparity that broke my heart. I was the silent benefactor of my own children's marginalization. the realization was a jagged, visceral shard of glass in my gut. I wasn't a daughter to them, I was a host organism, and they were the parasites, carefully camouflaging their hunger with a veneer of parental entitlement. The phone vibrated again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered, my voice a blade of ice. I'm looking at the statements, Mom. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a momentary silence as she scrambled to adjust her mask. Ally, you're overreacting as usual. We've always been transparent about needing a little extra help here and there. Your father's health. Transparency involves a conversation, not a 5-year clandestine drainage of my savings, I interrupted, the words pouring out with a terrifying, calm precision. I see the steakhouse dinners. I see the sale toys you bought for Daniel's kids with my money. I see the designer clothes. You didn't use this for essentials. You used it to maintain a facade of wealth while you told me my children weren't good enough for your table. You took my labor and gave it to the son who doesn't even bother to call you unless he needs something. The mask finally slipped, and the voice that emerged was unrecognizable, cold, sharp, and dripping with a twisted sense of grievance. And why shouldn't we? We spent 20 years pouring everything into you, Ally. The food in your mouth, the clothes on your back, the roof over your head, none of that was free. We made sacrifices you can't even begin to comprehend so that you could have the life you have now. You think a few restaurant bills and some toys for your nephews are too much to ask? We raised you. That entitles us to a certain level of respect and support. It's a debt you can never truly repay, but you could at least have the decency to keep the card active on a holiday. The sheer, unbridled entitlement in her voice made my skin crawl. It was the final, ugly truth of our family architecture. To her, parenthood wasn't a gift of unconditional love, it was a long-term investment strategy with a guaranteed payout. I was not a person to her, I was a retirement plan, an asset to be liquidated when the golden sun proved too expensive or too indifferent to help. You didn't raise me, Mom, I said, my voice shaking with the force of a lifetime of suppressed truth. You grew me like a crop. You tended to me just enough so that you could harvest me when the time was right. But here's the thing about debts, I've already paid mine. I paid it every time I ran your errands. I paid it every time I fixed your mistakes. I paid it every time I swallowed the hurt of your favoritism so that you could feel like a good mother. I don't owe you another cent of my life, my money, or my children's joy. You're being cruel, she hissed, her voice cracking with performative fragility. You're abandoning your parents. After all we've sacrificed. Sacrifice is what I do for my children every day without expecting a bill in return, I countered. What you did was perform a basic duty of care and now you're trying to charge me interest on it 20 years later. It's over. The account is closed. The authorization is revoked. And if you ever try to use a card with my name on it again, I won't just decline it, I'll call the police. The silence on the other end was absolute, a vacuum of stunned disbelief. For 30 years, I had been the reliable one, the one who could be shamed into submission with a sigh or a well-placed guilt trip. She didn't have a script for this version of me, the woman who had found the courage to enact a total, scorched-earth severance. You'll regret this, Ally, she finally whispered, the words sounding more like a curse than a warning. You'll be all alone. No one will want a daughter as ungrateful as you. I'm already not alone, Mom, I said, looking into the living room where Liam was tucking a blanket around Emma's shoulders as she drifted off to sleep. I have a family that loves me for who I am, not for what I can buy them. I hope that refined dinner was worth it. It was the most expensive meal you'll ever eat. I ended the call and didn't just put the phone down, I turned it off. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen for a long time, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The severance was complete. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, the phantom pain of a limb that had been removed, but beneath it, there was a burgeoning sense of lightness. I had cut the parasitic cord that had been draining my spirit for years. I was no longer the authorized user of my parents' misery. I was the sole proprietor of my own life. As I walked toward the living room to join my real family, I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was still raging outside, and I knew the fallout was only beginning, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had reclaimed my worth, and no amount of ancestral debt could ever take it back. The weeks following that fractured Thanksgiving were characterized by a silence that felt less like peace and more like the heavy, pressurized stillness before a tectonic shift. I had changed the locks, blocked the primary lines of communication, and retreated into the fortress of my own home, finding a strange, rhythmic comfort in the mundane. I spent my mornings watching the frost lace the windows and my evenings reading to Emma and Lucas by the fire, convinced that the worst of the storm had passed. I thought that by cutting the financial cord, I had finally rendered myself invisible to them, that once the reliable shadow stopped producing light, they would simply turn their gaze elsewhere. I was wrong. I had underestimated the mercenary depths of a pride that had been wounded not by loss of love, but by loss of control. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a colorful furniture catalog and a water bill. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, formal and imposing, with my father's precise, architectural handwriting scrawled across the front. There was no "Merry Christmas" or "Thinking of you" embossed on the flap. I felt a familiar, Pavlovian tightening in my chest as I brought it into the kitchen. Liam was upstairs putting Lucas down for a nap, and the house was draped in a rare, heavy quiet. I sat at the island, the same place where I had once meticulously planned family dinners and addressed their holiday cards, and tore the envelope open. Inside was not a letter, but a ledger. For a moment, I simply stared at the pages, my mind refusing to synthesize the information. It was a multi-page document, printed with clinical coldness, titled Statement of Outstanding Parental Investment. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was holding. It was an itemized bill for my own existence. My parents had spent 48 hours of their refined retirement scouring decades of old bank statements and checkbook registers to calculate the cost of raising me. It was a masterpiece of pettiness, a granular accounting of every cent they had ever sacrificed on my behalf, presented with the chilling detachment of a corporate liquidation. I felt a hysterical, jagged laugh bubble up in my throat as I began to scan the lines. 1996, braces, $4,200. 1998, piano lessons, which I had begged to quit, $1,850. 2001, summer camp, $900. It went deeper, spiraling into a microscopic obsession with the mundane. There were entries for school lunches, for the ER visit when I broke my arm at 6 years old, for the prom dress I had cherished, and even for the estimated cost of utilities and board from age 18 to 22. They had even included the interest. The final sum at the bottom of the last page was bolded and underlined, $78,564.42. The absurdity of it was so profound it felt hallucinogenic. I sat there, the paper trembling in my hands, as the full weight of their mercenary nature finally settled into my bones. This wasn't just a request for money, it was a psychological assault. It was the ultimate act of coercion, a desperate attempt to weaponize my own childhood against me. By putting a price tag on every meal I had eaten and every bandage they had applied, they were attempting to strip away the very concept of family and replace it with a cold, litigious contract. They were telling me that I was never a daughter, I was a debt. I was a long-term loan that they were now calling in with predatory interest. A small post-it note was attached to the back of the final page. In my mother's elegant, looping script, it read, "Since you've decided to treat our relationship as a business transaction by cutting us off, we expect full reimbursement for the resources we provided you. If payment is not received or a schedule isn't established by the end of the month, we will be forced to pursue formal litigation. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, ally. Just pay what you owe." Litigation. The word felt like a splash of ice water. They were threatening to sue their own daughter for the cost of her upbringing. I realized then that their love had always been a facade, a thin, decorative layer of paint over a foundation of pure, unadulterated entitlement. They didn't see the thousands of hours I had spent fixing their lives or the thousands of dollars they had already siphoned from my account as payment. To them, those were merely the dividends. They wanted the principal back. They wanted to bankrupt me, not just financially, but emotionally, ensuring that I would be so buried in debt that I would never have the strength to stand up to them again. Liam walked into the kitchen then, sensing the shift in the air before he even saw the papers. Ally? What is it? I couldn't speak. I simply pushed the stack of papers across the counter toward him. I watched his face as he scanned the itemized list, his brow furrowing in confusion that quickly sharpened into a mask of pure, unbridled disgust. Is this a joke?" he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "They're billing you for your own childhood? $12.50 for a field trip to the zoo in 1994? It's not a joke, Liam," I said, my voice sounding hollow and metallic. "It's a ransom note. They think they can buy back my subservience by making me feel like a thief for being born." He flipped to the final page, his jaw tightening as he read the threat of litigation. "They can't be serious. No judge in the world would look at this as anything other than harassment. It's pathetic, Ally. It's the most pathetic thing I've ever seen." But as I looked at the list, I didn't feel the same anger Liam did. I felt a strange, cold clarity, a final, absolute realization of their true nature. For years, I had mourned the fact that they loved Daniel more. I had agonized over what I lacked, what refinement I was missing that kept me on the margins of their affection. But looking at this ledger, I realized that Daniel's childhood was likely an investment they were happy to make because they saw him as an extension of themselves. My childhood, however, was a burden they had been tracking like a bad investment. They didn't love Daniel more, they just valued him as an asset. I was merely a liability. The coercion was so transparent it was almost pitiable. They were using the only language they understood, the language of the market, to try and force me back into my role as the reliable shadow. But they had made a fatal calculation. By putting a price on my life, they had finally set me free. If my childhood was a transaction, then the transaction was complete. I owed them nothing because they had successfully killed every shred of filial obligation I had left. They had traded a daughter for a spreadsheet, and in doing so, they had forfeited any right to my future. I reached out and took the papers back from Liam. I felt a surge of incandescent power, a white-hot resolve that cauterized the last of my grief. I wasn't going to hide, and I wasn't going to pay. I was going to take this mercenary little document and I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to litigate a mother's soul. "I'm not paying them, Liam," I said, my voice now steady and resonant. "I know," he said, stepping around the counter to pull me into a firm, protective embrace. "But what are you going to do?" I looked down at the $78,564.42 figure one last time. It was a high price for a childhood, but a bargain for the truth. "I'm going to pay them a visit," I whispered. "I think it's time they saw the unrefined version of me one last time." As I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, I realized that the porcelain hadn't just fractured, it had been ground into dust. And from that dust, I was building something they would never be able to itemize, a life that didn't belong to them. The drive to my parents' house was a funeral procession for the woman I used to be. The late November landscape was a skeletal blur of gray and sepia, the trees stripped of their dignity, standing like silent witnesses to the cold front moving through my soul. For 30 years, this route had been paved with a desperate, frantic need to please, a rhythmic thumping of my heart that asked, "Will I be enough today? Will they finally see me?" But as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles a ghostly white against the leather, that old anxiety had been replaced by a heavy, crystalline defiance. I wasn't going there to negotiate or to plead for a reduction in the interest of my existence. I was going there to perform a long-overdue demolition. Their house sat at the end of a manicured cul-de-sac, a sprawling brick monument to the refined life they curated with such suffocating precision. Even the gravel in the driveway seemed arranged to discourage any unseemly outbursts of reality. As I stepped out of the car, the air was biting, a sharp, clinical cold that lunged at my lungs. I clutched the thick, cream-colored envelope, the ledger of my supposed debts, and felt its weight like a stone. This was the final spectacle of their control, the last reaching hand of a dying regime. I walked to the front door, not with the hesitant knock of a daughter seeking entry, but with the firm, percussive strike of a woman demanding an ending. My mother opened the door, her features instantly settling into a mask of tragic, martyred grace. She was wearing a cashmere wrap the color of oatmeal, her hair perfectly coiffed, a visual representation of the peace I had supposedly shattered. "Ally," she sighed, her voice a fragile reed. "We were hoping you'd come. Your father and I have been so distressed. We truly believed that once you saw the figures, you'd understand the gravity of your abandonment." I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped past her into the foyer, a space that felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to Daniel's achievements. Framed photos of his graduations, his wedding, and his refined sons lined the walls like icons in a cathedral of favoritism. My father appeared in the archway of the study, his expression smug and paternal, as if he were waiting for a tenant to hand over a long overdue rent check. "I see you received the statement," he said, his voice resonant with a hollow authority. "It wasn't easy to compile, Ally. But we felt it was the only way to make you realize the sheer scale of the investment we made in your future, an investment you've decided to treat with such casual disregard." I stood in the center of their polished hardwood floor, the very floor I had spent hours waxing for them when my father's back was too sore to manage. I pulled the itemized bill from the envelope, the pages fluttering slightly in the draft. I looked at the $78,564.42 figure, the price tag they had placed on the love they were supposed to give for free. "Is this what I am to you?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, vibrating with a resonance that seemed to rattle the fine crystal in their display cabinets. "A ledger? A collection of field trips and dental appointments? Did you keep this tally in your head every time you tucked me in? Was every 'I love you' just a placeholder for a future invoice?" "Don't be dramatic, Ally," my mother snapped, her refined veneer beginning to crack at the edges, revealing the mercenary sharp set of her jaw. "It's about fairness. You cut us off financially. You humiliated us. If you want to treat us like strangers, then you must settle the account. It's only right." I looked at them both, two people who had spent their lives building an altar to themselves, using my labor as the mortar. I felt a sudden, exhilarating surge of catharsis, a white-hot light that burned away the last tethers of my guilt. I held the ledger up between us, the paper crisp and offensive in the dim light of the foyer. "You want an accounting?" I said, my voice rising in a steady crescendo of defiance. "Fine. Let's talk about the thousands you siphoned from my credit card while I was working 60-hour weeks to provide for my children. Let's talk about the hundreds of hours I spent as your unpaid servant because Daniel was too busy to care. Let's talk about the emotional cost of watching you treat my children like second-class citizens in their own family." "That's different," my father blustered, stepping forward. "That was your duty. We are your parents. And I was your child." I roared, the sound echoing through the hollow halls of their house. "But you've made it very clear that being your child is a transactional arrangement. So, here is my final payment." With a slow, deliberate motion, I gripped the top of the ledger. I felt the resistance of the heavy paper for a fraction of a second before I ripped it down the center. The sound was a sharp, jagged crack, a percussive snap that felt like the breaking of a spell. I didn't stop. I ripped it again and again, until the statement of outstanding parental investment was nothing more than a handful of white confetti. I let the pieces fall, watching them flutter down onto their pristine floor like snow on a grave. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if I had struck her. My father's face turned a mottled, bruised purple. You ungrateful little, do you have any idea what you've done? We have lawyers, Ally. We will take this to court. We will take everything." I stepped toward him, my eyes locked onto his, and I saw the flicker of genuine fear behind his bravado. I wasn't the reliable shadow anymore. I was an ultimatum in human form. "Please," I whispered, the word carrying more weight than a scream. "Take me to court. I beg you. I want you to stand in front of a judge and explain why you are suing your daughter for the cost of her childhood milk and socks." I want you to present this itemized bill, alongside the statements of the thousands of dollars you stole from my account using a card you weren't authorized to touch for luxury dinners and toys for Daniel's kids. I want the world to see the refined parents who put a price on their daughter's soul because she finally stopped paying for their lifestyle. Do it. I'll make sure the local news is there for the spectacle. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a bluff being called. It was the sound of a hollow empire realizing its walls were made of paper. My father's jaw worked silently, but no words came out. My mother's eyes darted around the room, looking for a script that would save her, but there was none. They had overplayed their hand, blinded by their own arrogance, and now they were standing in the wreckage of their own making. I am done, I said, my voice dropping back to a cold, level tone. I am done being your bank, your servant, and your scapegoat. You have no daughter. You have no grandchildren. You have your refined house and your golden son. I hope they're enough to keep you warm, because you will never see a cent, a second, or a smile from me ever again. If a lawyer contacts me, I will file criminal charges for the credit card fraud. That is my final offer. I turned on my heel and walked toward the door. I didn't look back at the photos of Daniel. I didn't look back at the woman in the cashmere wrap or the man in the study. I stepped out into the biting November air and felt a sense of lightness so profound I thought I might float away. The weight of the $78,000 debt was gone, replaced by the priceless realization that I owed them absolutely nothing. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of them in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway, two small, diminishing figures framed by the cold light of their empty museum. They looked frail, bitter, and profoundly hollow. I realized then that they weren't the architects of my misery, they were the prisoners of their own. I turned onto the main road, the heater in my car humming a steady, comforting tune, and for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't driving home to a fortress. I was driving home to a life. The cycle was broken. The altar was down. And the horizon had never looked so wide. The month of December had historically been a minefield of aesthetic expectations and emotional attrition. In the years that preceded this great severance, Christmas was less a celebration of birth and more a grueling exhibition of my mother's curated perfection. I remembered the suffocating weight of it, the stiff, velvet dresses Emma was forced to wear until her skin chafed, the way I had to police Lucas's every movement to ensure no heirloom ornament was disturbed, and the relentless, exclusionary air of my parents' home where the golden cousins were always given the center stage while my children were treated like background extras in a high-stakes play. But this year, the air in our home was different. It was thick with the scent of pine needles, burnt sugar, and a resilient, unshakable peace. Our Christmas was a messy, glorious sanctuary. There were no white glove inspections or hushed reprimands. The living room was a chaotic landscape of crumpled wrapping paper and half-finished gingerbread houses, a testament to a family that was finally allowed to breathe. Liam and I had spent the morning in a state of quiet resolution, realizing that we had successfully replaced the toxic traditions of my past with something far more durable, an authentic, chosen joy. We weren't walking on eggshells, we were dancing on them. Emma and Lucas were in their mismatched pajamas, their faces sticky with peppermint, laughing with a frequency that felt like a symphony of victory. This was the family I had built, a resilient unit that didn't require a ledger to prove its worth. The doorbell fractured that symphony on Christmas Eve, just as the blue dusk was beginning to settle over the snow-dusted lawn. I felt a momentary, phantom tightening in my throat, a residual echo of the woman who used to scramble to the door to appease her visitors. I looked at Liam, who offered a steady, grounding nod. I walked to the entryway, my pulse rhythmic and calm, and opened the door to a scene that was as performative as it was predictable. There they stood, my parents, framed by the cold winter air, looking like characters from a carefully staged holiday card. My mother was draped in her signature pearls, her face arranged into a mask of sugary, tragic longing. My father stood beside her, his hands braced against a massive, beautifully wrapped box adorned with a bow so large it looked satirical. It was a visual masterpiece of reconciliation, a grand, material gesture intended to bypass the wreckage of the last few months with the sheer force of its generosity. "Ally, sweetheart," my mother began, her voice a practiced, melodic lilt that aimed for forgiving matriarch, but landed squarely on desperate actress. We couldn't let Christmas pass like this. We've been so heartbroken. We brought this for the children, it's the grand playhouse they've always wanted. Please, let's put the past behind us. We're family. Family unity is all that matters during the holidays. I looked at the giant box, then at the two people who had so recently attempted to litigate my very existence. The irony was so sharp it was almost physical. They were offering a playhouse to the children they had deemed too unrefined for their dinner table just weeks prior. I didn't see a gift, I saw a Trojan horse. This wasn't an act of love, it was an act of utility. They were realizing that without me, their Wi-Fi stayed broken, their groceries went uncollected, and their refined social circle was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why their daughter and grandchildren were suddenly absent from the holiday narrative. They didn't miss me, they missed the services I provided. They missed the reliable shadow that made their own light seem brighter. It's a beautiful box, Mom, I said, my voice devoid of the anger that had defined our last encounter, replaced now by a cold, surgical clarity. But we don't have room for it in this house. We've filled the space with things that don't come with a price tag. My father cleared his throat, his expression shifting from smug confidence to a flicker of genuine irritation. Ally, don't be difficult. It's Christmas. We're making a grand gesture here. Most daughters would be grateful that their parents are willing to overlook such unpleasantness. The word unpleasantness sent a spark of amusement through me. To him, the theft of thousands of dollars and the systematic exclusion of my children were merely unpleasant hurdles to be cleared by a large enough gift. It was the ultimate performative gambit, the belief that loyalty could be purchased and that boundaries were simply obstacles to be negotiated away. I'm not being difficult, Dad, I replied, leaning against the doorframe, feeling more resilient than I ever had in their presence. I'm being honest. You didn't come here because you love Emma and Lucas. You came here because your house is quiet and your bank account is lower and you realize that Daniel isn't going to fix your television or drive you to the doctor. You want your utility back. You want the daughter who functions as your concierge. But that version of me died on Thanksgiving. My mother's face contorted, the sugary facade finally dissolving into the bitter lines of her true nature. How can you be so exclusionary? On Christmas Eve? We are your parents. We gave you life. You gave me a bill for that life, I countered, my voice steady and resonant. And I paid it when I walked away. My children aren't props for your holiday photos, and I am not a line item in your retirement plan. You chose a refined dinner over us. Now, you get to enjoy the silence that comes with it. You're being cruel, Ally, she hissed, her eyes darting to the interior of our warm, messy house, where she could hear the echoes of the children's laughter. You're keeping them from their real family. No, I said, and for the first time, I felt no guilt, only a profound sense of resolution. I'm keeping them from people who think they are too much. I'm keeping them in a home where they are exactly enough. Take the box back to your house. Maybe Daniel's kids can use it. I'm sure they'll appreciate another gift bought with someone else's money. I didn't wait for her retort. I didn't wait for my father's bluster or the inevitable guilt-laden sigh. I reached for the handle and slowly, deliberately, began to close the door. For a split second, I saw their faces, the shock, the indignation, and beneath it all, a hollow, terrifying vacuum where their love for me should have been. They were strangers to me now, two people whose only connection to my life was a shared surname and a history of fractures. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound of the season. It wasn't a slam, it was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of their car door shutting and the engine fading into the distance. The performative ghost of my past was finally gone. I walked back into the living room. Liam looked up from the floor where he was helping Lucas assemble a plastic dinosaur. Everything okay? He asked softly. I sat down beside him, pulling Emma into my lap. She smelled like cocoa and wood smoke, her small heart beating steadily against mine. Everything is perfect, I said. I looked around at my chosen family, at the husband who had stood by me when I was a shadow, and the children who were the bright, loud, unrefined sons of my universe. We were resilient. We were whole. And as the Christmas lights twinkled against the window, reflecting off the glass like 1,000 tiny stars, I realized that the greatest gift I had ever received wasn't in a box. It was the courage to shut the door on the people who didn't deserve to see the light inside. New Year's Eve was supposed to be the final threshold, a symbolic border crossing away from a year defined by the slow, agonizing disintegration of my biological family. Inside our home, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet, defiant celebration. We had traded the high society galas and the performative, refined gatherings of my parents' world for a sanctuary of our own making. The living room was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of candles and the rhythmic blinking of leftover holiday lights. Emma and Lucas were adorned in oversized party hats, their faces lit with the manic, beautiful energy of children allowed to stay up past their bedtime. Liam was pouring 2 glasses of champagne, his smile a warm, steady constant in the shifting tides of my life. For the first time in 30 years, the ticking of the clock didn't feel like a countdown to another disappointment, it felt like a countdown to liberation. I felt, perhaps for the first time, that the mountain of their expectations was no longer insurmountable. Then came the knock, a sharp, percussive intrusion that shattered the domestic melody of our evening. It wasn't the tentative tap of a neighbor or the cheerful arrival of a friend. It was a rhythmic, demanding pounding that carried the unmistakable weight of entitlement. I felt the familiar, visceral chill of an impending ambush. I looked at Liam, the champagne bottle mid-pour, and saw my own apprehension mirrored in his eyes. I walked to the door, my heart hammering a frantic staccato against my ribs, and peered through the peephole. There they were, a unified front of dysfunction, my mother, my father, and Daniel, standing like a grim tribunal against the backdrop of the swirling December snow. They weren't there with gift boxes or sugary pleas this time. Their faces were set in masks of litigious coldness, a chilling evolution from their previous attempts at manipulation. I opened the door just a crack, the freezing air biting at my skin. "What do you want?" "It's nearly midnight." "We're here to discuss the future, ally," Daniel said, stepping forward with the practiced, abrasive confidence of a man who had never been told no. He was dressed in a tailored wool coat, looking every bit the golden sun my parents had sacrificed my happiness to polish. "Mom and Dad have been talking to their legal counsel. You've been very clever with your little severance act, but you've forgotten one thing: you don't have the right to keep these children from their family." My father stepped into the light, his eyes gleaming with a predatory focus. "We've been looking into grandparents' rights, ally. In this state, a judge doesn't take kindly to a mother who uses her children as pawns in a personal vendetta. We have decades of evidence that we've been a constant, loving presence in their lives. You can't just erase us because you had a tantrum over a dinner invitation." The word litigation hung in the air like a poisonous vapor. The audacity of it was breathtaking, the sheer, unadulterated toxicity of people who would rather drag their own grandchildren through a courtroom than admit they had been cruel. They were attempting to use the law as a final, desperate leverage to force me back into my role as the reliable shadow. They wanted access to the children they had called unrefined, and a lot, not because they loved them, but because they couldn't stand the thought of losing the power they held over me. "You're serious?" I asked, a jagged, hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "You're standing on my porch on New Year's Eve, threatening to sue me for the right to see the children you uninvited from Thanksgiving? The children you've ignored for every one of Daniel's son's milestones?" "We are very serious," my mother hissed, her refined mask completely discarded now, revealing the mercenary heart beneath. "We have the resources, ally. We have the standing. You think you've won because you ripped up a piece of paper? That was just the beginning. We will bury you in legal fees until you're begging us to take them for the weekend." For a moment, the old fear flared, the sensation of being small, of being a child again, trapped in the shadow of their insurmountable authority. But then, I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. I remembered the years I had spent as their unpaid concierge, the invisible engine that managed their digital lives, their finances, and their secrets. I realized then that their greatest mistake wasn't their cruelty, it was their belief that I was too weak to have been paying attention. "You want to talk about evidence?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous thrum. I pulled my phone out and tapped the screen, the blue light illuminating the shock on their faces. "I've been your technician for a long time, Dad. I set up your cloud storage. I managed your email accounts. I fixed your frozen tablets." I swiped through a series of folders I had meticulously organized over the last few weeks. "I have every text message where you and Mom laughed about how wild and unrefined my kids are. I have the voicemails where you, Daniel, called them a burden and told me to sequester them so they wouldn't ruin your dinner. And most importantly," I paused, looking directly at my father, "I have the itemized credit card statements showing every cent you stole from my account for luxury goods while I was struggling to pay for Emma's speech therapy. I have the receipts for the toys you bought Daniel's kids with my money." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of stunned horror. The leverage they thought they held had evaporated in the glow of a 5-inch screen. "I want you to think real carefully about what grandparents' rights looks like in a courtroom when I present a digital trail of financial abuse, verbal cruelty, and systematic exclusion," I continued, my voice gaining a resonant, unshakable power. "You want a judge to look at your lives? Fine. Let's look at all of it. Let's look at the refined grandmother who used her daughter's savings to buy pearls while her grandchildren were being treated as inconveniences. I promise you, by the time I'm done, the only rights you'll have is the right to stay 500 feet away from my family." Daniel's face turned a mottled, bruised purple. He looked at my parents, seeing the defeat in the sag of their shoulders. The ambush had failed. The golden sun had no script for a sister who had stopped playing her part. "You're being unreasonable, ally," he muttered, his voice losing its abrasive edge. "We're family. This doesn't have to be so ugly." "It's been ugly for 30 years, Daniel," I replied. "I'm just the first one who had the courage to turn the lights on. Now, get off my porch." I didn't wait for them to move. I stepped back into the warmth of my home and gripped the handle. "Happy New Year," I said, the words a final, crushing benediction. I slammed the door and locked it, the sound of the deadbolts sliding home feeling like the final note of a long, discordant symphony. I leaned my back against the door, my chest heaving, the adrenaline coursing through my veins like liquid fire. I looked at Liam, who was standing in the hallway, his face filled with a fierce, quiet pride. I looked at Emma and Lucas, who were oblivious to the war that had just ended, counting down the final 10 seconds of the year. 10. 9. 8, they shouted, their voices bright and unrefined and perfect. I walked toward them, leaving the toxicity of the past on the other side of that door. As they reached 1, and the air was filled with the sound of plastic horns and joyous shrieks, I realized that I had finally achieved the ultimate victory. I hadn't just defeated them, I had replaced them. I was no longer a daughter of their architecture. I was the architect of my own life. The new year had begun, and for the first time, the horizon was mine. The world had bloomed into a vibrant, unapologetic symphony of green, a stark contrast to the skeletal, frozen landscape of the winter that had nearly consumed me. It was a Saturday in late April, the kind of afternoon where the sun felt like a warm, steady hand resting on my shoulders. I sat on the porch steps, a glass of iced tea sweating in my palm, watching Emma and Lucas chase a frantic trail of iridescent bubbles across the lawn. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and lilacs, a perfume of renewal that seemed to seep into my very bones. As I watched them, Emma, with her hair streaming behind her like a silken banner, and Lucas, whose laughter was a percussive, joyous riot, I realized that I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. The shadow that had followed me for 30 years, that cold, architectural disapproval of my parents, had finally evaporated in the light of my own liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I existed in a state of true equilibrium. The frantic need to be useful, the desperate urge to be refined enough to earn a scrap of affection, had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of self. I looked at my phone, resting face down on the wooden slat beside me. It had been silent for months. After the New Year's Eve ambush and the exposure of their digital and financial betrayals, my parents and Daniel had retreated into the hollow shells of their own making. There were no more emergencies that only I could fix, no more itemized bills for my existence, and no more sugary threats of litigation. The severance was absolute, and in that void, I had found a sanctuary I didn't know was possible. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, and felt the weightlessness of my own spirit. I had spent so long believing that family was a blood oath of suffering, a debt that could never be settled, a contract that required the systematic erasure of my own needs to fuel the egos of the people who had raised me. I had been taught that loyalty was synonymous with silence and that love was something to be earned through endless, grueling service. But as the sun warmed my face, I saw the generational lie for what it was. Family is not a cage built of DNA, it is a chosen sanctuary of mutual respect, a place where you are loved not for your utility, but for your very breath. Emma caught a particularly large bubble, her face lighting up with a triumphant glow. "Mommy! Did you see that? It stayed whole." "I saw it, sweetie," I called back, my voice resonant and clear. "It was perfect." I watched her run back to her brother, and I felt a profound sense of peace regarding their future. By breaking the cycle, I hadn't just saved myself, I had shielded them. They would grow up in a house where their energy was celebrated, not managed. They would never have to wonder if they were refined enough to sit at a table. They would never be billed for the food they ate or the love they received. I had taken the jagged, broken pieces of my own upbringing and ground them into the soil of this new life, ensuring that the only thing they would inherit from me was the knowledge that their worth was non-negotiable. Liam stepped out onto the porch, 2 plates of sandwiches in his hands, his presence a steady, grounding force that required no performance. He sat down beside me, our shoulders brushing in a casual, intimate contact that felt like the most natural thing in the world. He didn't have to ask if I was okay, he could see the liberation in the way I carried myself, in the lack of tension in my jaw, and in the way I no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. "They're getting fast," he noted, nodding toward the kids as they zigzagged across the grass. "They're getting free," I corrected softly. We sat there in a comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard. I realized then that the golden child and the reliable shadow were ghost stories I no longer told myself. Those roles had been discarded, left behind in the wreckage of a house that valued appearances over souls. I was simply ally, a woman, a mother, a wife, and an architect of her own joy. The horizon before me was wide, bright, and entirely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. As the sun began to dip toward the trees, casting a long, golden glow over our sanctuary, I took a final sip of my tea and felt a deep, resonant gratitude. The journey had been visceral and agonizing, a path paved with fractures and betrayals, but it had led me here. To this lawn. To these children. To this peace. I had traded a hollow, refined life for an authentic, messy, and beautiful one, and it was the best bargain I had ever made. The weight was gone. The debt was paid. And as I stood up to join my children in the grass, I knew that I would never, ever look back. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end of this journey. Sharing these stories isn't always easy, but knowing I have your support makes every word worth it. If this story resonated with your soul, please share your thoughts or your own strength in the comments below. Your voice might be the light someone else needs today. And if you feel a connection to our message of reclaiming your worth, I would be honored to have you subscribe and join our family here at Queen's Revenge. Remember, you are never too much, and you are always enough.